G'day guys, Solid here. Before we get straight into the video, I just wanted to set your expectations. This is definitely a first impressions ride review, so just keep that in mind as we go through it. I'm going to break up this video into the good and the bad, and then we're going to come back to the garage and I'm going to discuss the potential for this bike as a lightweight adventure bike, and I'm going to directly compare it to my old WR250R. So let's get into the video.
Brand new.
Yep.
Just be mindful.
That's all right. I'm not familiar with the area, so I'll probably putt around a bit.
So I've just hopped on this bike, and getting on I was paying attention to the height. I'm 180 centimeters tall and I could get the balls of my feet down on both sides when sitting on this bike. Now that's very comparable to the height of my WR250R or a DRZ or a WR450F for that matter. So it's very comparable to other enduros and the taller dual sports that are available. So if you're a shorter rider, you might struggle to get your feet on the ground a bit, but it's definitely not extremely tall for the segment, so it's nothing unexpected. So if you're average height, you should be fine. The gearbox is exactly what you would expect out of a Honda. It's very easy to find, neutral when you want it, but it doesn't jump into neutral unexpectedly. All the gear changes are smooth and crisp, and it's a very positive experience. The foot pegs were a nice surprise on the 450L. Now for those of you that don't ride off-road very often, it might be a bit of a silly thing to talk about foot pegs, but they're very important once you get off-road. You really want a good surface area to have contact with the bike, but also when you're standing up you want a wide foot peg so your legs don't fatigue as quickly when you're going through tough terrain. So the size of the foot peg is very important. And I'm happy to report that Honda have not been stingy, so you get a good decent foot peg straight out of the box on this bike, which is a nice little touch to see. The handling of the CRF450L on the road was quite good actually. It was very similar experience to my WR250R when it was completely stock. So it's quite nimble. The suspension obviously on this 450L is much better. So it's a little bit more of a firm ride, but it's very reassuring. You know where your front wheel is. It doesn't feel twitchy. It feels nice and planted for such a skinny little bike. So it's quite a nice experience on the road. The brakes on the 450L are quite good. Now they're not astounding. You're not going to get road bike super sport kind of performance out of your brakes on an enduro, but as far as enduros and dual sports go, I'd say the 450L lands in the quite good category. The brakes are very progressive in their feel, but they have plenty of bite, and you can instantly understand the capabilities of these brakes. It's not like you're worried about pressing that front lever and going over the front of the handlebars, but at the same time it's not like KLR 650 bad where you got to grab a fistful just to pull up at the set of traffic lights. So it makes a good balance. So I felt very safe and comfortable with these brakes. Taking into account that I only rode this on the road, I still wanted to talk about the suspension briefly. I think the suspension on this 450L is fantastic. It's definitely on par with other enduro bikes like the EXC range and the WR450F. It felt very similar to their suspension setups. This is definitely not dual sport suspension. This is most assuredly very good enduro suspension. So don't have any fears about the capabilities of the suspension if you're thinking of doing plenty of off-road. Now obviously if you're a bigger guy and you're doing lots of single track, you might need to upgrade the suspension somewhat, but for your average punter I think it'll be more than capable for most riders. So how's the power on the 450L? Well, I'm on the open class version, so that means we get the full power model, the US spec ECU and the US throttle body, but remember here in Australia we also get the restricted version that only makes 25 horsepower, so make sure if you're getting a test ride in Australia to ask for the full power version. Now, the power, I would characterize this bike as the gentleman's enduro. It's not quite as full on as a WR450F or a 500 EXE in its power delivery. That's not to say it's underpowered though. It has oodles of torque everywhere, which is just perfect. It's what you want out of a big thumper. Torque is where all the fun is had, in my opinion. Now the horsepower is obviously also good. It makes roughly 38 horsepower, so you got plenty of power. So you get up to speed quickly, you hold that speed easily, and you can overtake trucks really easily. You've got more than enough power for on the road, which is one of the big reasons I'm actually on this bike, is because my WR250R, while a great bike, just doesn't quite have the power I would like it to out on these highway settings where you can see all these big trucks all the time. So I can confidently say that this 450L will make a great lightweight adventure tourer, in that it has enough power to haul its luggage and get out of its own way on the highway. The stability on this bike is pretty damn good, especially for an enduro. It doesn't feel anywhere near as flighty at high speeds. It felt a lot more like a dual sport out on the open road, so I was very happy to find that out. But now I wanted to go in what's bad about this bike. So once you do get up to speed, it is a bit of a weak criticism, but you do get vibrations, very high frequency, high buzzing through the handlebars. Now, I'm sure that might be remedied with some aftermarket fat Renthal bars or Pro Taper bars, but it was a little bit of annoyance. But then again, the smoothness is still pretty damn good. This is even better than, say, a DRZ, but I'm just making it as a quibble because I was spoiled with how smooth my WR250R was. But this is still pretty good, but there are some vibes there to let you know you're on a 450 thumper. The next really crap thing is obviously the seat. Now, it's just an arse-numbing hate plank of a thing. It really isn't any good at all. It's worse than any dual sport. It's probably worse than a lot of the enduro bikes I've been on too. So it's not a deal breaker. That's easily fixed. I mean, most guys are going to go and get a Seat Concepts or something similar anyway to uprate the comfort on this thing. But you have been warned, don't expect any kind of comfort out of the seat on this bike. So the biggest complaint I have about this bike is the snatchy throttle. It was something I really wanted to pay attention to because I've seen a lot of criticisms about this online and in reviews, and it's something that I am not so much worried about on road. It's more off-road, particularly in the tight single track. A snatchy and lurchy throttle just means you're going to be stalling it quite a lot, at least in my experience with snatchy bikes. So I can say that snatchy throttle is definitely there. I think it's due to just how much the engine cuts off the fuel when you back off on the accelerator. So the engine cuts it right down to about idle speed, so it's a pretty drastic drop. So you find yourself feathering the clutch a lot and trying to compensate with that. Now, I have heard that the Vortex ECU pretty much solves all those issues. I can't confirm that because I haven't been able to get a ride on a Vortex installed CRF450L. So that does give me a little bit of concern and would be my number one gripe and the first thing I would want to fix if I was going to be doing a lot of single track on this bike. So definitely take note of the snatchy throttle. Pricing was a controversial thing when it first came out. It has dropped in price here in Australia significantly, so it's still in my bad comment because of how expensive it was to start with. So when they first released this, the full power version was over $13,000, which is pretty much the same price as the 450X, which is also road legal and more capable off-road. So I really don't know why it was so similarly priced when the 450X is just pretty much ready to race, as opposed to this, it softened down a bit and made a bit better for the road. So the buyers they're trying to appeal to are more dual sport orientated, and dual sport riders are very price focused. So it seemed very strange to price it in the competition of the WR450F and the 450EXE out of the gate. Now they have dropped that as they realized what they've got on their hands here with the 450L, but it was a very strange move to start with, and I think it really hurt them at the beginning. And I do know that it's still quite expensive overseas, but currently the bike I'm on as it stands now in Australia is $10,500, so that's $1,000 more than a WR250R. Now you're definitely getting $1,000 worth of performance and equipment extra over the 250R, so I think they've priced it perfectly as it stands now, but it still is quite an expensive bike, and I know that will be a big barrier to many dual sporters. Those who are familiar with enduro bikes, it's actually quite a cheap price, but still, given that Honda was so wishy-washy with their whole pricing of this bike, I'm putting it in the bad column. Standing up on this bike wasn't too bad, but it's in the bad column because I'd need some taller bars or at least some risers to be fully comfortable on this bike standing up. My last complaint for this bike isn't the bike's fault, and I do feel a bit silly as it's a first world problem, but that was just how hard it was to get a test ride on this bike. I've got a few Honda dealerships that are only 15 to 20 minutes from my house, but it took 5 dealerships for me to get a test ride on this bike, and I had to go over an hour out of my way just to get to this dealership in particular. Now I am thankful for Honda eventually letting me get a leg over, so thank you very much for that. I am appreciative, but like I said, it was frustrating in that I had to justify why I wanted to ride this bike on the road. All the dealerships were very confused that I wanted to ride an enduro and see its characteristics out on the highway in particular. They just had very confused looks on their faces, and I often got turned down. Now that just shows me that, at least here in Perth, the salesmen really don't know the potential of this bike and what they've got on their hands. A lot of guys are actually looking at this as a lightweight ADV bike or a dual sport bike, just like the 500 EXC or the 390 Beta RR. Now this bike, yes, it can do single track and I would use it for that, but I also want to throw my bags on the back and do a multi-day camping trip. So I want to see how this does out on the open highway should I have to ride many kilometers on the highway, which has happened to me in the past on my other dual sports. So of course I wanted to know how this went on the road. So it was a little confusing to see that Honda really don't know the kind of buyers that they're looking for with this bike. Yes, there'll be guys who want this purely for off-road, but there'll also be those who want it for lightweight ADV and just as a dedicated dual sport. So I think this leads into the discussion of how I think this bike would do as a lightweight adventure bike. Now to do that, I think we'll go to the garage where I'll compare it to my WR250R and my other riding experiences. So we'll flick over to there now. So I think this CRF450L really does have some potential for a lightweight adventure bike. I'm already seeing some great channels pop up about just that. It has many attributes that make it great compared to other enduros. The first is that it has a proper subframe at the back, so it can actually carry quite a bit of luggage, so that's a definite plus. The other thing is the gear spread. When I was riding this at about 100 to 110, which is our highway speeds here, it's very comfortable sitting at those speeds. It's also very stable. It's not over revving, it has plenty left to overtake trucks and maintain even higher speeds. So that's another real plus in my book for this bike's potential for being a lightweight adventure bike. The elephant in the room usually is the oil change intervals. It's every 1,000 kilometers, which is 5 times as much as a WR250R and generally much higher than a dual sport. That's one of the things of enduro bikes. They need a lot more maintenance. Now, initially this really put me off this bike, but as I thought about it more and more, the things that this bike offers, I could put up with the frequent oil changes for the benefits you get. You get that extra power for the highway, you get that lighter weight, you also get that better suspension. So there's a lot of things you gain in losing durability of the motor. I definitely think this would be a fantastic lightweight adventure bike as long as you're happy with working around the frequent oil changes and maybe the slightly buzzy handlebars. Those are the two compromises that I'm most worried about, as well as that snatchy throttle, but I have heard that that's a fairly easy fix with the Vortex, at least, fingers crossed. So let's talk about how the WR250R compares to the CRF450L. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is price. When the 450L first came out, that was one of my major gripes. It was about $5,000 more than the WR250R. And having ridden it, I can tell you I don't think it's worth $5,000 more than the 250R. Now the price has dropped since then significantly, and there's only about $1,000 difference if you're good at haggling. So with $1,000 disparity, I think that's a much better comparison. In fact, I think you get more than $1,000 worth of parts on the 450L that you don't get on the 250R. Namely, the suspension is much higher spec, the performance of that motor is much higher spec. So those two things alone, I think, justify the price differential. The comfort part of it does make itself apparent. The 250R has a much smoother motor. That means it's much less vibes at highway speeds. The seat as well, the seat is terrible on the 450L. Now the 250R, the seat isn't great either, but it's still a noticeable difference. There's bad and there's terrible, and the 450L is just a nightmare. Even after 10 minutes I was uncomfortable on the 450L, so the comfort goes to the WR250R. Now the elephant in the room is clearly that the 450L is a better bike specification wise. It's got far better suspension, the power and performance figures are better, it's lighter weight, it's got more high-end components. That's all true. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the right bike for everyone. For me, for instance, I think the 450L, initially at least, would be too much bike for me. It's got too much power for me to be able to control it off-road. The suspension's a lot firmer, so I would get knocked around a lot. I'd get more fatigued. I've had that experience having ridden dual sports and enduro bikes. The enduro bikes always beat me up more. It takes more effort. Whereas the WR250R, it's a bit softer. The power isn't as hardcore, so it's very comfortable. So I think the 250R wins as far as comfort off-road, and if you're a new rider, it's a very capable bike, but it really is complementary to someone that's got very basic off-road skills. The 450L, I think, is going to be the better bike if you're a dual sport veteran and you're kind of looking at the enduros, looking at how they do have better power and better suspension, but you don't want to sacrifice all the benefits of a dual sport. Then I think that's where the 450L makes more sense. The next thing is the aftermarket. It's a very important part of a dual sport and an enduro, is how much accessories they have to tailor the bike to your needs. Now with both of these bikes, they're very evenly matched. Almost every component you get on the 250R, you can also get on the 450L. The big thing for me, the hang up that I have, is the gas or petrol tank differences between these bikes. With the 250R, I think there's a better range of offerings. It has a better spread of catering to different tank size requirements. The last major difference, and probably the biggest difference in my opinion, is the service intervals between these two bikes. So the 250R has really good service intervals. You're looking at 5,000 kilometers for the oil changes and much higher kilometers for valve checks. I think it's something like 40,000 kilometers off the top of my head. So it really is big distances before you have to open up a motor on a 250R. And I can report from first-hand experience that these motors are absolutely bulletproof. On the other hand, we've got the 450L. It's a much more involved motor. You have to service it frequently because it is an enduro motor. So again, we've got a dual sport versus an enduro. So it has oil changes every 1,000 kilometers, and you have to check the valve clearances every 3,000 kilometers. So this is quite a low maintenance motor compared to other enduros, but it's a high maintenance motor when compared to dual sports. So regular followers are going to want to know which of these two bikes I've made a decision on, and the answer is I haven't. Even though I've ridden both of these bikes now, I still want to have another ride on the 450L, and I really want to make another video getting down into the nitty-gritty comparing these two bikes before I make a final decision. So stay tuned for that video in the future. And as always guys, I've been Chronicles of Solid, and I'll see you in the next video. Catch you later.